Welcome, everyone. You're in workshop Healthy Relationships and Sex Education for All. If you are in need of captions for this workshop, please see the chat box, and there's a link there. Please keep your microphones on mute until the end, and you will get a chance to ask questions then. You can also post questions inside the chat area too. When it is time for questions, you can raise your hand. The raise hand button can be found in the reactions button area. And then we will call on you, regarding your question then. And we will get started in a few minutes. Let's just wait for others, to actually switch over. We'll give it like one more minute.
Lynn, am I okay to go ahead and share the PowerPoint?
Yes, go ahead.
Cool. All right, let me know if folks have any issues seeing our presentation here.
Nope, you're on.
Cool.
I'm noticing there's still like 29 others who are trying to get into a group. So I just want to give them one more minute. But I don't want to lose your time either, because I know that's been happening all day today. So I want to respect your time too.
No worries, we can definitely wait, and then I'll just wait till you kind of give us the green light and we'll get started.
Okay. Okay, let's get started. Let us welcome our presenters, Marley Mahan from the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, and Raleigh Pellar from the Opportunity Tree. And I will let you guys get started.
Yes, hi. I'm so excited to be here. Hello, everybody. My name is Rayla Pillar. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with blonde hair, blue eyes. I am wearing a black shirt, and I have a bright blue background behind me with some picture frames. My co-presenter, Marley Mahan, will be helping to facilitate this discussion today, and I'm very excited about it. We're going to be talking about healthy relationships and sex education for everybody. Go ahead, Marley.
Thanks, Rayla. So hi, everyone. My name is Marley Mahan. I use she, her pronouns. As Lynn mentioned, I'm one of the sexual violence response coordinators here at the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. I'm a white woman with glasses. I have brown hair that's kind of in a bun. And behind me, I have a bookshelf. Yeah, so we're excited to get started. And we'll kind of talk through what the session is going to look like. So there's kind of three main areas we're going to cover in today's session. First, we're going to look at sexual abuse and disability. So we're going to really understand the statistics, some of the risk factors. We're going to look at victim blaming, and really just look at the prevalence of sexual violence in these communities. Next, we're going to talk about the importance of sex education, right? That's really the focus of our presentation today. We're going to talk about preventing sexual abuse, adult decision-making, and understanding healthy versus unhealthy interactions. And then we'll look at how do we begin these conversations around, healthy sexual education. What do those conversations look like? We'll look at taking proactive approaches. We'll explore some local and national resources, and then we'll look at some of our individual responsibilities. Any questions or anything before we jump in? Cool. We're excited to share this information with you all today. So we will get started. So like I said, this first section is really going to be talking about the prevalence of these things. So we're going to go through some statistics, understand the disproportionate way people with disabilities, and specifically people with intellectual or developmental disabilities, are impacted by sexual violence. So that's really going to be the beginning focus here. So I want to start this presentation by really grounding ourselves in understanding sexual violence. Here at the Coalition, we like to describe sexual violence as an umbrella term. So on the screen, we have an umbrella, and we have all the different specific sexual violence acts that would be under that sexual violence umbrella. And so the first one that we often kind of associate with sexual violence is rape. Now, another reason why we like to use the term sexual violence is it's a lot more inclusive of all the things that can be considered sexual violence. And we know that that particular word, rape, is often used in like criminal justice settings, and can be really triggering to survivors to just use that term. But so we know that that's one example of sexual violence. Some other terms that we have here under this umbrella include sex trafficking. That might be a concept we've heard of before, also known as like sex exploitation, sexual exploitation. Another example of sexual violence is non-contact unwanted sexual experiences. So sometimes when we think about sexual violence, we only think about the contact, right? So someone like physically touching us, but we know that there are unwanted sexual experiences that don't involve that touch that are still under that umbrella of sexual violence. Another term we have under this umbrella is made to penetrate. That's a term we sometimes see in research. It's really just inclusive of understanding all the people impacted by sexual violence and the ways that that can look. Another term under this umbrella is sexual harassment. So we often see that term in maybe like workplace settings, so like at work or at school. Sexual coercion is another example of sexual violence. That's both a tactic of sexual violence and an actual form of sexual violence. So those are going to be coercive statements, ways that people are kind of forced into different acts of sexual violence. And then lastly, under this umbrella, we have stalking. We know that there can sometimes be a sexual nature to stalking, and so that's why that's included under that umbrella as well. So like I said, jumping into the statistics to really understand the way this community is disproportionately impacted, we know that people with disabilities are 3 times more likely to experience sexual assault than people without disabilities. Now, when we look a little bit more specific, we know that people with intellectual disabilities are 7 times more likely to experience sexual assault. So this is a high prevalence for sure. We know that 2 in 3 of sexual assault survivors with disabilities have multiple disabilities, right? So people having, more than just one disability. Looking kind of more specific at young folks, so children, we know that children with disabilities are 3 times more likely to experience sexual assault than children without disabilities. And then looking a little bit more specifically, we know that children with intellectual or mental health disabilities are 5 times more likely to experience, sexual violence. We know that sexual violence survivors with disabilities who are part of the deaf community are more likely to experience more severe victimization. They're more likely to experience victimization for a longer duration, so a longer period of time. They're also more likely to experience multiple instances of abuse, and they're also more likely to have a larger number of perpetrators. So this is, I think, kind of a helpful way to understand when we look at perpetrators or people who cause harm, the kind of things that they're keeping in mind when they look at who are the folks that they're going to cause harm to. And so on the screen, we have kind of a Venn diagram. So we have a circle for accessibility that overlaps with a circle that says vulnerability and another circle that says credibility. And so when it comes to the things that people who cause harm, like I said, are perpetrators, the things that they look for are that accessibility, that vulnerability, and that credibility. And so We know when we're talking about people with disabilities, especially people with IDD, like we talked about, that there's, multiple circles that folks in that category could kind of find themselves in here. So when we look at accessibility, who do people who cause harm have access to harming? What does that access look like? Credibility, so who are the people where if someone experiences harm and they report that, they share that with someone, who are the people, that folks maybe think are less likely to be believed? We know that that's something that people who cause harm can kind of look at. And then that vulnerability aspect. For any reason, vulnerability can look like a lot of things, right? But so we know that people, like I said, who cause harm look for those three things. And there's a lot of, I think, populations and people that we can think about being in the intersection of those three categories. So now we're going to talk about victim blaming. So oftentimes, all too often, when people experience harm, when they experience sexual violence, and they look to report, they look to seek help, sometimes, unfortunately, they're met with victim blaming. And so the definition of victim blaming that we have here is placing responsibility on the victim for the crime or wrongdoing committed against them. So we know when it comes to sexual violence, the way that we address these things is we address it with the people who cause harm, right? That's how we stop sexual violence. But unfortunately, sometimes victim blaming is really normalized in movie and TV shows, and just the way that we approach survivors, that it can create additional trauma, additional struggles for those survivors. So some examples we have of victim blaming, it could sound like things like, she wouldn't do that, she's an excellent caregiver, right? It might sound like, are you sure he wasn't just helping you? Other ways it might sound, no one would assault someone like you, that's just ridiculous. Or you wanted to do it, I'm sure you enjoyed it. So these are harmful messages, like I said, that survivors can sometimes be met with that don't support them in, finding healing after sexual violence and seeking services and navigating that experience, but really just place the blame of that harm that was caused on them themselves. Some additional examples of victim blaming. So these harmful statements might look like, she lives in her own reality, we need more evidence before we can do anything, right? This idea that we need this evidence, looking back at that credibility piece that we just talked about. Why didn't you tell someone? I would never let someone do that to me. It might sound like he's just so easily confused, I doubt something like that happened. Or people in wheelchairs can't be raped, they don't even have sex. And so I know these are really harmful things to listen to. It's hard to, when you're navigating, trying to feel better after something harmful like sexual violence happened, to be met with harmful statements like that. And so that's why a lot of the work we do here at the Coalition is raising awareness of victim blaming, of how harmful that can be. There's a lot of research that supports the first person that a survivor of sexual violence discloses to, so shares that information with, really makes or breaks whether or not they decide to go on and tell anyone else, maybe report to police, whatever that looks like for them. So the first person a survivor shares with is so important. And so I think that's why all of us can be aware of what victim blaming is, avoiding saying those statements ourselves, and calling it out when we see it, because we know it's harmful. So looking at the consequences of victim blaming, right? This causes psychological harm to victims. It really harms survivors in addition to the harm they already experienced. Lack of offender accountability. So when we only look at the victim or the survivor and we place all that blame on the victim, we're not actually addressing the issue of the harm that was caused with the person who caused it. So that person is kind of, not held accountable. And there's a decrease in a community sense of safety, right? When sexual violence happens, it can make us, make the community feel unsafe. Sorry, my dog's needed some food, so we're replenishing that. Sorry if y'all heard that. But so all of these consequences ultimately lead, as the arrow will show us on this slide, to more violence, right? It doesn't address the issue of violence. It only leads to more violence happening, more harm happening. So now I'm going to read some quotes we have on this slide and the next slide from people with disabilities, really talking about their experience navigating reporting. So it says, some with disabilities are afraid to report it because they're afraid it will make them look bad, worse than they already are, because people already look down on you because you're disabled. It felt like the world was against me. So that's a survivor talking about their experience and all the things that they were kind of up against to report and get services and help. Another person shared, "We are not believed. Right away, the cops think you asked for it. So you really do have to keep telling. They don't even think that we're reliable witnesses." So going back to what we talked about, that credibility piece, we know that even on the people who are supposed to help us sometimes, right, the cops, other advocates, sometimes they're also impacted by these harmful stereotypes, these harmful messages in the media. And so their willingness to believe people, to support people, is also impacted by those things. So there's a lot of barriers that folks are up against in getting help, in getting the support they need after experiencing sexual violence. So looking at some more barriers to reporting, some of the things that we have on this slide include, folks might not recognize the experience they had as sexual violence. That's why we kind of looked at how we describe sexual violence in the beginning of this presentation, all the things that make up sexual violence. It's totally normal for folks to not recognize that, especially when we don't have that education, right? The thing that we're really here trying to say is important. There's a lack of knowledge about healthy sexuality, what that looks like in practice, right? We know that another barrier to reporting could just be language or communication barriers, right? As we saw in the quotes that I just read, this fear of not being believed or being blamed, right? Victim blaming is a really common issue, and so it makes sense that a survivor, knowing the way that people respond to victims or survivors, would be nervous to then be in that position, report that themselves. There can be a fear of retaliation, so a fear that the person who caused them harm in the begin with might cause them harm again once they find out that they report it, right? That's a really valid fear that folks might have. A fear of being institutionalized or of a new unknown caregiver, right? There's a lot of unknowns. That's an additional barrier to navigating that. There's this loss of autonomy, right? So this loss of like your own decision making, your own ability to decide what feels right or feels best for you, which can lead to more isolation, more supervision, and more restriction. People might feel guilty about filing charges, right? It's totally normal to feel guilt because, that's just a normal response that survivors might have in navigating next steps of that sexual assault. There's sometimes a financial dependence piece, right? People might be financially dependent on the person who caused them harm. And then a disbelief in successful prosecution, right? So a belief that even if they do report, what's the likelihood that the person who caused them harm is going to, experience justice, whatever that might look like. So when it comes to survivors with disability receiving, victim services, and so that can look like, getting an advocate, a victim advocate to walk through that process, going to a support group, any sort of kind of service related to that sexual violence instance. We know that only 13% of survivors with disabilities receive that victim service assistance. So there's a lot of work to do to make sure survivors with disabilities are receiving those services and receiving that help and support. As far as barriers to accessing services, we know there's limited awareness and knowledge or understanding of effective practices to support survivors. So unfortunately, some of the agencies who do support survivors of sexual violence aren't always equipped with how to specifically support survivors with disabilities. There's sometimes a lack of coordination between the victim service providers, so those victim advocates, those folks, and the disability service systems and organizations. So those folks aren't as aware of the services that each organization provides, and there's kind of a lack of coordination and collaboration there. We know that there's physical, communication, accessibility issues, that all programs aren't kind of set up to support people with disabilities. There's sometimes a lack of awareness about the continued oppression of people with disabilities. So people, especially service providers, just might not be as aware of supporting people with disabilities and the history of oppression that this community experiences, right? That goes into kind of a lack of training. There might be transportation barriers, right? And just a lack of accommodation. So sometimes programs might not already be set up to provide the necessary accommodations and support and help to survivors with disabilities. Something that we're doing here at the Coalition, we have a grant to specifically look at how are victim service providers, how are those victim advocates supporting survivors with disabilities, where could they be improving, where is there an opportunity to better support their survivors, and how can we help them with that training, with making sure their agencies are supported to do those things. So as unfortunate as it is that there are those barriers, just know that there is work being done in Arizona to address that and to better serve survivors with disabilities. Now I'll turn it over to Rayla.
Okay, thank you so much. So as I mentioned in the beginning, my name is Rayla Pillar. I work as a program manager for the Opportunity Tree. I oversee the DTA and employment services for our adult programs in our Avondale site. And I'm also an MSW intern that works with ADDPC. So I have a lot of different experience in working with people with IDD. And a lot of what is currently happening in talking about sexual abuse and sex education focuses on the 3 R's. So the 3 R's are recognize, respond, and report. So a lot of times when we're talking about sexual abuse or sex, we're talking about recognizing these signs of abuse. We're talking about abusive behavior and what that looks like, and patterns of abuse. Then we're talking about responding to it. So if somebody has been abused or has experienced sexual abuse or sexual violence, how can we create a safe space and validate those experiences to make sure that somebody is comfortable receiving the services that they might need? And then reporting. Providers and a lot of people that interact with people with IDD are mandatory reporters. And so it's making sure that we are talking to somebody that makes that person feel safe. And then we're contacting the appropriate authorities if necessary. So these are the 3 R's that we talk about a lot. We talk about recognizing and responding and reporting. And you can go ahead to the next slide. But we need to talk about the difference between proactive and reactive responses. So the 3 R's are reactive. We're responding to sexual abuse. We're responding to something that has already happened. We are recognizing something that has already happened. We're reporting something that has already happened. We want to start taking a proactive response. So proactive means we're doing something to make sure that it doesn't happen in the first place. So how can we be proactive in addressing sexual abuse and sexual violence? You can go ahead to the next slide. So the biggest takeaway that I want to convey here is that knowledge is power. It is so important to know all of the things that come with sexual behavior and sexual assault and sexual violence, and also what it means to be healthy with that. And being here and part of this conference is a huge part of that. It's collecting the information that you need in order to be empowered with it. Go to the next slide. Thank you. So what we're going to focus on is sex education as a proactive preventative technique. So just as I mentioned before, there's the 3 R's, but ideally we don't want to have to get to those 3 R's. We don't want to have to recognize and respond to sexual abuse because we want to make sure that it doesn't happen. And so it's important for us to know what sexual behavior, healthy behavior, what that looks like in order to adequately identify what is unhealthy. You can't know what is healthy if you've never been told what is healthy. And you're not going to be able to know what unhealthy behavior is if that's the only thing that you have ever been told about. So educating about that is crucial. The second piece of this is that sexual hormones and interests and feelings are all human. Whether you have a disability or not, people have sexual desires and interests, and that's normal and it's natural and it's okay to talk about. And so having education about that is empowering. And access to that accurate information, it increases the ability to make safe, informed choices. So if we're not talking about something, it's hard to make an educated decision about it because you don't know what it is you're deciding. So it's important to have that accurate information. So part of kind of getting into that education piece is talking about healthy relationships. What are they? What do they look like? What do they consist of? How do you do it? How do you have a healthy relationship? And there's not really one way to go about it. I think a lot of people, we have experiences in our life where we've seen maybe our parents or our friends, maybe our coworkers, and we've seen what those relationships look like and whether or not they look like that person is happy or they're not. And it's important to remember that healthy includes safety as well. So is everyone in that relationship safe? Are they being honest with one another? Are they being able to use effective communication? Is it respectful? Does everyone in that relationship feel respected and feel heard? Is there trust? Do people feel like they are not being heard or they're not being listened to or they're being controlled? Touch. Is touch good? Is it bad? Is it included? Not all relationships include touch, and that's okay. But making sure that the touch that is occurring is happy and healthy. And then compromise. All relationships include compromise. They all include some semblance of give and take. And so these are just a few things that can be involved and should be involved in a safe, healthy relationship. And so knowing what that looks like and being able to identify that is really important, because then when one of these factors is missing, you'll notice that something is not right about that interaction. So a really, really big part of a healthy relationship is consent. And consent is kind of a weird word and it gets thrown around a lot, but we don't usually talk about what is consent. And a lot of times when we talk about what consent is, it's only ever talked about when we're talking about sexual relationships or sexual touch. But the reality is consent is very basic. Consent starts as soon as you start being able to interact with people when you're just a tiny little baby. I'm sure, you know, everybody can think of instances in, as soon as kindergarten, where we were interacting with other people and someone might have asked, can I borrow your crayons? Or do you want to play tag? Those are all examples of consent. You're agreeing to something. You're agreeing to participate in something or to share something. And so that is consent. And that still applies to interactions that we have with other people. So it's really important to remember that in talking about sexual education and talking about our bodies, your body belongs to you. It doesn't belong to anybody else. It is your body, and you always get to decide whether or not something is okay. And so consent means saying yes to something. It is something that you are giving completely freely. It is reversible. It is informed. It is enthusiastic, and it is specific. So I really liked this image because I love fries. It's a really good acronym to remember what is consent. And remembering that it's freely given. So it's not something that you're having to coerce out of someone or convince them. And sometimes that can look like, oh, come on, I know you said no, but I really want you to say yes. Don't you love me? That's not freely given. And so it is in all caps, yes, it is something that you want to do. and it's communicating about what is okay. So as an individual, you can give consent and you can also receive consent. So you can give consent if somebody asks you, can I give you a kiss? And you can say, yes, that's okay. But you can also be the one that asks for consent. So you can be the one that says, can I give you a hug? And a really important part to remember in talking about consent is that consent has to stop with the answer. So if you ask somebody, can I give you a hug? And that person says no, you don't have consent to do that. And that needs to be the end of that discussion. To continue to pester that person until they agree with you is not freely given.
And I just want to add to Rayla, I talked about sexual coercion under that sexual violence umbrella. That would be an example of it. So if someone says no and the person says, come on, please, like any kind of teasing someone about that no or being forceful about it, that's an example of sexual coercion.
Mm-hmm. So building off of what Marley just said, consent is not forcing somebody to do something that they don't want to do. So if somebody says, no, I'm not really interested in that, and you continue to ask questions and pester about that, that is coercion. That's sexual coercion, and that is not consent. Making somebody feel bad because unless they agree to you. So making fun of somebody, oh, come on, how come you won't do it? That's not consent. That is coercion. Lying to somebody. So this could be lying to somebody about not having had sex before or having had sex before, or lying about how many people you're interested in seeing or not seeing. All of that is really important in having a healthy relationship. You need to be honest with one another, and lying cannot be a part of that. Threatening somebody. If somebody says, no, I don't want to do this, and you say, well, if you don't do this, then I'm going to tell on you, or I'm going to tell your parent, or I'm going to tell your friends, that's a threat, and that's not consent. And another really important thing to remember is that consent is not permanent. So if somebody says yes, they can then turn around and say no on another day. It's not something that once it's given, it can never be taken back. People are allowed to change their minds. And so something can be okay one day, and the next day it might not be okay anymore. And that's a really important thing to remember about consent, is that it's not permanent. It can be taken away as well. So in talking about sex education, what are some of the barriers that keep us from doing this? So it's a really important thing, but there's a lot of barriers to why we aren't providing this sort of education. And a lot of it is rooted in stigma. There are a lot of beliefs that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities aren't interested in sex, or they're asexual people. They're not interested in it. So why would we need to teach them about it? There's also a lot of fear. There are beliefs that if we teach people about sex, then that will make them really sexually aggressive, or they're going to not have any control over it, or they're going to act out. And that's not true. There have been a lot of studies that show that access to sex education it doesn't increase these types of sexually deviant behaviors. It's important in providing people this necessary education. Infantilization, that's a really big word, but what it means is we're treating people like children. And there are a lot of beliefs like infantilization that impact people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. People think that we don't need to teach them about sex or sex education or about relationships because that's not appropriate. Why would we talk to them about sex? Because they're like a little kid, and that's not true. People that are adults, and they deserve to have that information. And then accessibility. So accessibility practices that do not consider the needs of people with disabilities inhibit their access to this education. And that can look like a lot of different things. That could mean having a training that doesn't have a sign language interpreter, or having a training that doesn't have audio descriptions or have captions. That could also mean having an educational, sitting down and having a training that uses a lot of really, really big confusing words that don't make any sense. And then you end up leaving and not knowing what was talked about. That's inaccessible. So it's really important that when we're talking about breaking down the barriers to sex education, that we're addressing all of the different things that impact it. So this is a quote from a self-advocate that everyone always tells me that I have the mindset of a 5-year-old. And that goes back to the stigma and the infantilization that we were talking about in the previous slide. People with IDD are not children. They are not, the mindset of a 5-year-old is not accurate. And we have a lot of people that deserve to have information that are having that information withheld from them because of these types of perspectives and philosophies. So this is a really, really big kind of confusing slide. And there's a lot of questions here. And these are conversations and questions that can encourage us to start talking about this. So things like, I want to be in love. What is online safety? What does that look like? What is an STI? Or somebody coming to you and saying, this lady at work touches my arm and I don't like it. Or somebody sent me a picture without their clothes on. Questions like, what does it mean if somebody is gay? Or what is birth control? It could look like something that they are already doing. I've been talking to somebody online and they want to meet me. Or does it hurt to have sex? What about, how do I even start dating? Or my boyfriend says that he wants to start having sex, but I don't want to. What is a healthy relationship? I've been watching videos online. Gender is a spectrum. And how does someone get pregnant? So these are all conversations that have to do with sex education. And even though things like, I want to be in love versus gender is a spectrum, even though it might not seem like those are directly related, they are. And they're all conversations about human sexuality and interacting with one another in a healthy, safe way. And that can include topics like online dating, or what kind of materials are available online, what you're interested in. How do you talk to people? What are you interested in doing with a boyfriend or a girlfriend? What does it mean to be queer? Or what LGBTQ means? These are all important things for us to be talking about, because these are all questions and conversations that are constantly happening, and it's important for us to have them. So this is one of my favorite quotes. It's by Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. And he said, anything that's human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. And I think that this really applies to the conversation of sex education and what that looks like for people with disabilities, because sex is normal, and sexuality and human behavior, that is all a human, normal, natural thing. And if it's human, then we can talk about it. It's mentionable. It's something that we can have. We can have these conversations. And I know on the last slide, there were a lot of questions and things that were probably listed on there that maybe made some people uncomfortable. And maybe you didn't know what that was. And maybe you had some questions yourself. And so remembering that all of these conversations about human sexuality and about relationships and about being a human and interacting with people in a healthy, safe way, that's all something that we can and we should talk about. And because we know that that is a mentionable thing, it's a manageable thing. And when you look at the previous slide, how you look at it and there's just all of these questions and there's all of these topics, and it's really confusing to look at and you don't know where you're going to start, it can feel really overwhelming to talk about sexual behavior and sexual interests and practicing safe sex. That can be a really intimidating thing to even think about, because where do you even start? But when you apply this, if we can talk about it, it's manageable. It's something that we can talk about with one another, and we can start addressing this big issue. Because when we're talking about all of these horrific statistics and things that are happening, it's important for us to remember that this is something that we all have a part in, and this is something that we can all participate in talking about. So before we play this, this video, I want to talk about the responsibilities that we each have in this discussion. So if it's mentionable, it's manageable, and that looks different for everybody. So if you are a self-advocate and you are interested in learning about sex education and learning about healthy relationships, and you want that information, you deserve to have that information. And there are resources that are available to you, and there are resources in Arizona and nationally. And that is something that you deserve to have access to. And I really implore you to find somebody in your life that supports you, to either help you access that information, or for you to research that based off of the resources that we will have listed for you at the end of this presentation. For providers, DDD providers specifically, it's really important that staff and people that are working with this population, that they are very comfortable with recognizing, responding, and reporting sexual abuse, the 3 R's. And even though that is a reactive measure instead of a proactive measure, those are so important in helping to minimize sexual assault and sexual violence with this population. That is crucial. It's also really important for providers to be having these conversations with the people that they serve. It's important for us to talk about how we can have these conversations and providing this information to the people that you're responsible for serving. For parents and families, I implore you to use the resources that are available and start having these conversations young. Just like, it's mentionable. We can do this. It feels really uncomfortable to think about having a conversation about sex, but it can start as early as just having a conversation about consent. And that doesn't need to be a conversation that talks about sex. That can be a conversation that talks about touch and just giving hugs. And that can start really young. And so when you start empowering people at young ages to have that language and to be able to say no and to know what to do when things don't feel right, that is really empowering. And then as a broader society, we're all part of solving this problem. We're all part of increasing sex education and reducing stigma and reducing victim blaming. And increasing the normalization of people with disabilities having relationships and what that looks like to have safe and healthy and happy relationships with people. We're all a part of having those conversations. We're going to see them in TV. We're going to see them depicted in movies. We're going to see them depicted in real life. And it's up to us to know what is appropriate and what we can help encourage to help these conversations start happening on a more regular basis. And with that, we can go ahead to the next slide and go ahead and play this video.
So I actually think I didn't share the audio, so I'm just going to quickly stop sharing and then I'll reshare. And I'll just preface this video with a couple of years ago here at the coalition where I work, we had a Sex Turned Up campaign. And so this was a campaign that was really targeted at how do we start these conversations about sex, about consent, about boundaries, and how do we do it in a way that isn't awkward, but that's fun and that we can really get a lot out of. And so right now, we're actually revamping or kind of turning that campaign into a campaign specifically for folks with disabilities, with IDD, to have these conversations. And so this is a project that we're working on. We're gonna start kind of putting that information out there and recruiting self-advocates to be part of this project. So as you watch this video, just consider if that's something that you're interested in learning more about and participating in yourself, to really start having these conversations that Rayla really just talked about the importance of having. So let me go ahead and share my screen again, make sure the audio is on. And then if folks have any issues hearing the audio of this video, just let me know in the chat. Okay, and hopefully folks can see the screen all right.
Communicating good boundaries when you're talking about sex or affection is really about loving yourself
Hey, Marley.
and loving
Yeah,
I'm
people
not
around you.
I'm
by
not seeing the
sharing-
video itself.
The
I'm
video's
hearing
not
the
on.
audio though.
oh, sorry, I turned my video off on accident. Okay, thanks for letting me know. Okay, let me try this one more time. Sorry, y'all. So audio's clicked. Okay, let's try it again. Something weird happens when I click audio where I can't see everyone's video. So just let me know again. Thanks, Rayla.
Communicating good boundaries when you're talking about sex or affection is really about loving yourself and loving the people around you. By sharing what's important, by sharing where your edges are, you're letting them know how to take care of you.
Some people make assumptions, think they have this privilege that they can touch and grab and do those kind of things, and it makes you feel like a moving target.
When my boundaries are violated, I feel disrespected. I feel insecure. I feel angry.
I feel important. I feel cherished. I feel respected. And I feel powerful.
So let me stop sharing. So yeah, that was a fun campaign. We put together some videos. We had some conversation toolkits. So like I said, all things that we're looking to revamp, do again, but looking specifically at having these conversations with people with IDD. So be on the lookout. We'll be sending information out and emails out. But if that's of interest to you, I'm just going to drop my email in the chat. Sorry, I'm looking at the chat here. So feel free to send me an email like, hey, I saw that video that you shared in the workshop that I was in. I'd love to participate because we would like to really continue these conversations with this group. So let me go ahead and reshare. Okay. Can folks see my screen again? Cool. All right, so now we'll turn it over to see if folks have any questions for Rayla or I based on what we shared.
Okay, so you can either put your question in chat or you can raise your hand.
Yeah, it looks like I see Calvin and Paul with the raised hand. So if you're okay, let's start with Calvin and then we'll hear from you, Paul. And I think you're muted, Calvin.
Sorry, I greatly apologize.
No worries.
I just wanted to clarify, you mentioned right now that we should, that we can email you because you want to work more. with our group today specifically, or the group of people that you had on the video?
So for the videos that we're trying to recreate, we're looking to work specifically with the disability community, with self-advocates. So anyone at this conference is welcome to shoot me an email. If there's other people that you all think might be interested in participating in those kind of videos or projects, feel free to pass my email to them. But so that's something in the coming weeks, in the coming months, that we'll really be working on. And we really want it to be informed, like I said, by self-advocates to make sure it's super useful and effective.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I guess I'm next, right?
Yes, Paul, go ahead.
Well, my question is, I'm on this, and this is it was great to be in this workshop because I'm on a committee and we're looking at the stuff for people, for our athletes, and and I'm on this committee and we're looking at ways we can educate our athletes on this topic that we're talking about. Is there any way that some of this stuff about the video that you sent, I could attend this thing that you're referring to, so I could share with some of the people on this committee I serve and see if there's,
Yeah.
and tell them I went to this conference and that I can tell them I attended. And
Definitely, that would be perfect. Yeah, and like I said, I'm sorry we don't have a ton of information right now to share. We've just kind of got the funding for this project, and so we're early on in figuring it out. But I wanted to mention it in this workshop at this conference. So yeah, like I said, my email address, so just marley@acesdv.org, that's in the chat. So anyone who is at all interested in being part of this project, feel free to shoot me an email. And then once I have some more information to share with folks, I'll be sure to let you know. But Paul, yeah, that would be perfect. We'd love for you to be part of the project.
because I would like to, because I'm on this committee, I'd like to help out either way, and maybe it'll help our other athletes and around the state, because this whole presentation is good, and I would like to get more involved with this stuff, because that's what we're doing we're just developing our sex education program, and Special Olympics just got a grant for the sex education project. So we're looking at some of the stuff and some of the videos some of the slides you had, we did use some of it in some of our discussions with our athletes. And so.
Perfect.
That's really awesome to hear. I'm excited to hear that Special Olympics is doing that, and I'm really interested in hearing more about it.
Yeah. Cool. That sounds like a great fit. And then certainly if there's any other questions, feel free to let us know, but I do want to make sure we get to this resources slide that Rayla put together for us. So these are some resources specific to victim services we have here on the left side. So the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, that's the organization where I work. I know Erica just dropped in the chat a great resource that we created that was informed by self-advocates, that self-advocates created. That's a cool resource guide that we have. We'll also probably be referring to that when we work on this project that I talked about. So definitely check that resource out in the chat. RAIN, which is kind of the national organization on kind of sexual violence information. So they're a useful organization, and they have I know like a hotline and other resources for folks to utilize. We also have the Arizona Center for Disability Law. Also, Rayla, feel free to jump in if you want to speak to any of these.
Yeah, all three of those are really, really helpful. And then please know this is not an all-inclusive list by any means. Just like Paul mentioned, there are so many other organizations that are doing this really important work. So I really encourage you to kind of look up what's happening here in Arizona. One of the local organizations that's doing a lot of work on this is Raising Special Kids. They actually have an online training available to parents to learn more about how to talk to children of all ages, how to talk to folks with disabilities about their sexuality and about sex education. And that is actually on October 20th, so that's coming up very soon. ADDPC has also a lot of really great resources on their website that refer to some trainings that have been kind of vetted. There's lists that are available, and you'll find these lists on various different websites. ACES DB has some of the lists that then reference over to Raising Special Kids, which references back over to, so these resources are available out there. And then I also listed Elevatus training. That's just one opportunity. But like I mentioned before, and like Paul mentioned, there's a lot of other groups that are out there trying to increase this important topic. So these are just a few small examples of things that are available.
Yep.
And with that, we are all done. And if there's any other questions, please feel free to reach out. I know that Marley dropped her email in here. I'll go ahead and drop my email as well. Please feel free to reach out if you have any other questions or anything that you'd like us to add or talk about in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Is there anyone else that has any questions possibly in the chat, or you can raise your hand? We have a few minutes left if anyone has anything.
Hey, Lynn, it's Erica. Hey, of course
Hey,
I'm gonna say.
Great job, guys.
Can you guys
A
hear
round of
me?
applause to Rayla and
Yes, I can hear
Marley.
Erica.
Thank you, everyone.
I don't think Lynn can.
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay. Okay, I just had a quick good job, guys, and this is great information and great presentation. I just wanted to make a comment for anybody who's on this call. There is, I think that there's a group that's looking at trying to push a bill this legislative year to ensure that our students with disabilities in schools are actually intentionally included in sexual education efforts. And so if you want to be involved in that, I know Rayla is involved in this group. She's going to be coming this next year, and ACES DV is too. If you all want to get involved, just contact Rayla or ACES DV, because it's part of the sexual violence collaborative work that all these different organizations and self-advocates are doing together. And so there's actually a group that's focusing on advancing inclusive sexual health and healthy relationships, because that is the key to prevention. Thank you. That's all I want to say. And great job again.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we have a few minutes more they added to our time. And if there are no more questions, you guys get a little bit more time off, to get your tea or water and wait until our next one, begins. And